I'm Jason Roy. I'm from California. I work as an EMT back home. I've been doing that for about 2 years, and here I am.
Robin Goodlick. I am part of the C4L Tactical Operations Response Unit down at Hurricane Harvey.
Eddie Weiss, I'm the commander of the C4L Tactical Operations Response Unit.
So why don't you guys tell us a little bit, maybe like starting with you, Jason, how you got to Texas in the first place?
Okay. So over the summer, or the past 2 years, I've split my time working on the ambulance in Monterey County and working as an EMT at a science camp for the YMCA. And during the summer, I worked as an EMT full-time as a supervisor with them. And as the summer progressed, coworkers, planned a road trip to go from California to Ohio. And how I got to Texas was because I was on vacation. We had bought a car through Craigslist to drive it as far as we could to get to Ohio. And in this car, we had gone through Vegas, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. And while we were going through Roswell, trying to find aliens and UFOs, we ran into some coworkers who had paid us to go take them to Dallas. So our trip had us cut through the top half of Texas into Arkansas, just a quick day through Texas. But because our coworkers had paid us to go to Dallas, when we dropped them off, realized, Houston was only 4 hours south of where we were. I had been following the storm since the Grand Canyon and had periodically been checking Facebook of the updates going on in Houston and other surrounding cities affected. And of course, working in the medical field, I've got some training, and I couldn't just drive through Texas and not help out. I mean, 4 hours away is a simple drive, and convinced my 2 other friends to go down with me. So, they agreed, dropped our friends off, went down south, and ended up at a Costco parking lot about north of Houston. Did about 2 days of boat rescues. And at that point, my 2 friends had continued the road trip, and I had elected to stay. And at that point, after 2 days, things were getting pretty hazy. I had gotten shot at twice in those 2 nights of doing boat rescues, and kind of had a moment where, I don't want to keep doing this. I know there's more help elsewhere, and was kind of looking for an outlet and a location to go to. One of those was Katy, Texas, which was flooded pretty bad, but also Port Arthur, and the Golden Triangle in that area of southeast Texas. I found a group of people who were going down there in that area and was able to hitch a ride. So basically hitchhiked from Houston all the way down to Port Arthur. What was great is that when we first got there, it wasn't great, but what was nice to see is that there were so many volunteers from Facebook going to the staging grounds in Port Arthur. It was this Walmart parking lot. And at the time, since there was no single entity, there was no police, there's no fire, there's no FEMA or Red Cross. It was just a bunch of people who showed up to help with their boats. But there wasn't really any form of leadership or a place to check in. What was really cool, though, is that these groups of people, had their tents put out, and locals from surrounding cities were coming in, bringing supplies to those affected. Because Port Arthur was, at the center of all of this. There were so many people that were affected. There wasn't a evacuation order put in place. People were waking up in their homes with, a couple feet of water in there, and the resources were just stretched to a point where no one was getting any help. So with all these locals putting in and bringing, water, food, supplies, they didn't have a central location to give it to. There was no FEMA or Red Cross to say, hey, we'll take your stuff, we'll make sure it gets dispersed. So a couple of volunteers from Nebraska had set up their tents and said, yeah, leave your stuff here, we'll go ahead and get it to whoever needs it. But it wasn't like we were going out in trucks and going to house to house. We didn't kind of organize that till way later in the night. Because what had happened is this lady had brought in 100 cases of water and said, I live in this town, I'm just here to drop this off, I need to go back, can I leave this with you? And what was really cool is there's yeah, go ahead and leave this here, we'll make sure it gets to where it needs to go. And after hours had passed, more people had done the same thing, so this impromptu, this supply depot had kind of been built out of nothing, and volunteers, or people who came to volunteer were helping out. Eventually, a point came in the night where locals had figured out that we had all these supplies and were saying, hey, I've got my truck here. Why don't you fill my truck up with supplies and I'll take it to the churches where people have gone to, or the Red Cross shelter that just opened up that needs these things. So I spent my first night in Port Arthur doing just that, going from shelter to shelter and helping out and bringing the supplies where they needed to get to. The National Guard had gotten in, but they weren't really doing anything. They were kind of just setting up their kind of base camp of where they were. There was, one police officer at that Walmart parking lot just because Walmart was still open, and they were letting people in, but in very low numbers, just to not have like a riot or looting happen. But there wasn't like another cop out there that was out saying, hey, this is what we're doing, this is what we're doing. So what was amazing to see is all these people come together through social media, because that's where it was posted to go to kind of just come together and kind of just start this up. It wasn't until the next morning I kind of ran into these guys. There was a police officer named Lam Nguyen. He was in this red shirt, kind of walking about, and he goes and says, hey, I'm looking for anyone in the medical field. And it happened to be right there, and I was like, hey, here I am. And at that point, I followed him across the parking lot to a group of people setting up a tent, and that's how I met these two.
Eddie, Robin, how did you guys get to Texas?
So that was our tent, and it wasn't one of our medical units. When we were deploying down to Texas, we were called to go down to Houston, and so when we got to Houston, there was several thousand volunteers there with boats and vehicles, and there's ATF and DEA and U.S. Marshals and Texas Rangers, and everybody was already there, and we had been getting the reports on our way into Houston about these rescuers that had been shot at. The situation was getting really bad, and so when we arrived up in the Woodlands area, they were actually assigning armed people to go with the volunteers in the boats. And so, of course, at that time when we arrived there, we didn't realize that Jason was standing in the parking lot, so we didn't meet him, although we probably saw each other or passed at that point. And so that was very strange that we could have met right there. But what was happening was things were getting a lot more intense, and the hurricane was over. So, the situation is, a lot of this whole story is the fact that what you see in the media, whether you want to call it fake news or whatever's going on, it's not accurate, and the reports were very inaccurate. Even coming in, I know, Jason and I have talked about when he was on the way in, you'd read one thing and then you read another thing, and, there was, 1,200 bodies stacked in Houston, and, you were getting that kind of crap. But then there was also the news that, the hurricane had hit and everything was fine. And, it had dumped water, and so here was this flood, and so everything was the news was very contained and very compartmental. So when we showed up, we were supposed to be assisting law enforcement in Houston, and that was the original plan. And so what ended up happening was, as we were coming in, we were contacted by all hands. They were still looking for a location where they could set up base camp. They were getting ready to start recovery stuff in Houston already. That was where they were. And hey, let's help people get stuff out of the houses. They were looking for a solution for their housing, and so I was making phone calls trying to find them a church property, which we ended up doing up by Sugarland. And so we rolled into the Woodlands. Jason and I somehow at some point probably passed in the parking lot, but because there was all these volunteers, all of these people had amassed, Jason included, since we had left. So when we got there, there wasn't even room for our command vehicle, because our mobile command vehicle that they originally wanted was actually too large to fit in the parking lot. There was over 1,400 boats in a 2-block area that were sitting there waiting still to be deployed. So we went down the road, and we ended up, they just told us to hold. And so, of course, we were on the phone, and we were on the phone with the state, and we were on the phone with the city of Houston, and they just kept saying, wait, just hold, just hold, just hold. And so finally, I got a telephone call. They said, come on up and to this church in the Woodlands, where they were kind of coordinating this whole effort. At that point, Jason had gone. It was the next morning, and so Jason was on his way out. But they told us that they needed help in Jefferson County, which was an area I'm not familiar with at all. And I kind of, here we are in the heart of Texas, and they were kind of like, it's that way. And we really, I mean, I had no idea. So I was like, well, how are we going to get there? I know a lot of the roads are closed. And they said, hey, you're just going to take the interstate around the side of the, around the side of the city, and then you guys are going to head due east. And it really shouldn't take you all that long. They actually estimated that it was going to take us less than 2 hours. And I said, so what conditions are the roads? We're hearing about all this flooding. Now, one of the things that had been in the news to us, which I don't believe Jason was aware of at the time, like he said, people weren't being evacuated. So they were all there, and then they were waking up to water in their homes. So here's what's happening. We're driving like 90 miles, and the water's 2 to 4 feet deep, the whole ride. And so, I mean, it was insanity, because first of all, they were off a little. But what was happening, what we were hearing on the news, and of course they didn't have it down there, in Port Arthur, was the governor's office had to make a decision to start blowing levees to alleviate certain areas that were flooding. So what happened was, I believe he had blown one and was getting ready to do the other. So they were literally like opening gates, or however they were doing it. And that was to our north and to our east. So we were traveling east. This was happening ahead of us. So as we were driving, the water was actually getting deeper. And what it was overflow that was coming from the first one they had released. So even though the rain had stopped, I mean, it was relatively sunny, you look at our photographs of that drive, and we're like underwater, but it's sunny. But the water was going up. So this is what was happening in Port Arthur when Jason was arriving. This is why the rescues were all of a sudden starting, even though the hurricane, I think we were going in like 2 days after, I think. And so the hurricane was long gone, the rain had stopped. But now all of a sudden they're doing these evacuations and things in Port Arthur. So we stopped in Beaumont, Texas. We met up with the emergency manager, and we couldn't go any further. They had instituted a curfew. So no more help was going into Port Arthur that night. It was 7 p.m. And so while we were there, it was only Jason's group, and obviously we had no idea that anybody was down there. But so the group that Jason was with, all these volunteers, they were the only ones that were doing anything in the middle of the night, because there was a curfew. So we were all being held in Beaumont, which is like, I don't know, a half hour north. So the next morning we left, and we rolled into this Walmart parking lot where we had been assigned, and we had been told to look for Officer Lamb, that he was the one that was in charge, which the only person that seemed to not know that was Officer Lamb, because everybody kept coming to him going, hey, we're being told you're in charge. And he was like, yeah, I have no idea what's going on. So he was really trying to just keep the peace. So when we rolled in, the military was there. And like Jason said, and they were kind of setting up their own thing, but there was no instructions being given. There was nobody in charge. The civilian effort was well underway. Sun was coming up, and they were still amassing. People were still dropping stuff off. But now you had some refugees coming out of the water. You had some people walking into this Walmart parking lot. So they tightened the Walmart up quite a bit. And what they ended up doing was closing it to just responders. But when we first arrived, Officer Lamb said, put your command truck over there by the military, put your tents over here, and at the other end of the parking lot, which we did, and we thought that we were setting up command just for his officers. In fact, we had a conversation for about 15 minutes about how nice this was going to be for his officers. I was like, this is going to be, we're going to have fans in here, we're going to have beds where you guys can sleep, you're going to have desks in the front of it, we're going to light up your parking lot. You got no worries, man. We're here to take care of your law enforcement officers. And so we set the whole thing up, and we were just about done. Setting the tent up. And
Not really.
So
like 3 seconds being done.
So Robin had the crew setting up the tents, and I'll let you tell them, how well that went.
Got it set up the first time, and in a matter of a minute of it being completely set up, we were told to tear it down, take it back, and we were moving it approximately 200 yards away, just different location they wanted it at.
We weren't told why.
Yeah, there was no reason behind it.
It was just, we need you to be where there's more room, which, had they finished that sentence, would have helped.
Yeah, had they told us what was really going on, would have made a difference. So we went and we moved our shelter and got it set back up, and well, technically not even set all the way back up. We got it 3/4 of the way up, and our first helicopter landed. And the question was asked, why is the helicopter landing and why are they bringing patients to us? Because we're there to house the law enforcement and security. And come to find out, we evidently without being told, got turned into a medical depot.
Yeah, whatever we were for the first couple hours, because it was like, I mean, literally, like all of a sudden this chopper landed and we were holding on to the tent. I mean, we had no weight, we had no, I mean, nothing. It wasn't even all the way up.
Half our stuff went across the parking lot.
Yeah, we lost like half our stuff when slamming into the side of the Walmart, you know, at 200 miles an hour. And these PJs start pulling people off this Blackhawk, and then a Chinook landed with loaded. And I think it's like max loads like 14 on the thing, and they had like 18 on board.
Right.
And so all of these people are coming at our tent, and we have 2 med bags, which are this big, because, you know, how bad can things be? We're housing cops, and so we didn't even bring everything that we were supposed to bring. And, you know, I mean, had we known that we were doing medical, so we had these 2 med bags, and all of a sudden it was just absolute chaos. And at the same time, all of a sudden vehicles started pulling up. So it was like somebody pulled the plug. It was like all of a sudden the world was draining, and we were like the trap under the sink, because then all of a sudden people are coming across the parking lot at us, and they were like dripping wet, and people were dropping people off in trucks and everything else. And I turned around and I yelled at Robin, and I was like, we're gonna need, somebody has got to be medically trained. I mean, there's got to be more than us, because at this point we had a team of 5. I think, yes, 5, 4. We had a team of 4. And I was like, we've got to find somebody else. Isn't there anybody that's medically trained? Well, this is at that exact same moment where Officer Lamb has just told Jason to head to the white tents. So literally I just hear this voice that says, well, I am, and I turn around and Jason's standing there. And so I threw this med bag at Jason, one of the 2 med bags that we had, because I asked him if he had a med bag, and which he obviously didn't feel the need to bring, you know, on a vacation in a $600 Craigslist car. And so it was like, okay, so you have the front of the tent, I'll take the back. And after a couple minutes, we quickly realized the bags were empty. I mean, it was like seriously like that. I mean, we had everything from diabetes to exposure issues to, I mean, like everything all of a sudden at once. And so right about that time, this lady from a local hospital shows up, which we didn't get that explanation for hours, but it turned out their hospital was underwater. So that was one of the first regional hospitals to close, so she had just come over here. And so now we've got her, but we have nothing. I mean, like she showed up with like a Tupperware container, you know, full of crap, which looked like, you know, some like a family camping kit of like some gauze and Band-Aids. And so we told Robin to head to Walmart. And so Robin went bulk shopping at
Tactically acquiring
things. She went over and had a conversation with the manager at the Walmart. And you know how they push the carts, like, you know how they take the whole line of carts and they push them all the way across to get them back in the store. So Robin did that out the store, only all the carts were full. And so she like literally went in there and emptied the entire pharmacy section of the Walmart. So I mean, it was everything from Band-Aids to cough syrup to the wheelchair. We got the only wheelchair they had, we got the wheelchair. Splints, tape. There was like, I mean, everything. Yeah, markers. So we had rubber gloves. I mean, like everything. She just took, if you can imagine the whole pharmacy, she just like took it all. And so about that time, we still weren't very organized, but then people kept bringing more food too. And so they were stacking it around our unit. So and clothes. She had truckloads of people that were just like dropping off clothes, and then somebody else would be like, you want me to sort this? And we'd be like, we don't care. We don't even know why you're doing this. And so, I don't know, it went that way for about 5 hours, I suppose, right?
It was pretty intense for the first like 5-6 hours, just because it was just us for a while. We were constantly getting people coming in, getting dropped off by truck, by boat, by helicopter, just going off of what we could do. And you know, what was interesting, we did have a local clinic just down the street from where we were that was open for, you know, CT scans, X-rays, and had arranged, you know, transport. Because the idea of this whole, you know, clinic that we were setting up, or this med tent, was that anyone who that was coming off the helicopters would either, you know, if they're in need for medical attention, would get it, and if it was, you know, it turned out they needed something more, then they would go to a hospital or this clinic. And if they were
Which was information we got from, what's her bucket? Because we didn't.
Jennifer. Yeah.
And that was the lady from the hospital. She was like, we can send some people to our ER. Yeah. But our ER is not sustainable, and we have to shut it down at dark.
Yeah.
So now we're running a timeline.
Because they had a skeleton crew staffing it, so they couldn't go all hours. But at that point for the afternoon,
And we should probably add that now the water's starting to come up again.
Yeah.
The second levee has let go. So we should probably, you know, this is the point where we should probably mention the fact that unbeknownst to us, we're trying to figure out why there's this massive influx of boats and trucks. What we didn't realize was the water level's now going up in Port Arthur, and the town that we had spent the night in the night before up in Beaumont had actually already flooded and the power was out, where that had not been the case 6 hours earlier. So situation was getting kind of worse around us, and night was coming. We knew we were losing the ER. And so then another group showed up.
Yeah, another group of nurses from like Central Texas had showed up in a couple vehicles and a trailer. I think it was a total of maybe 6 nurses and 2 nurse practitioners, which made the whole process easier because at this point it was just me and Robin kind of getting things handled. And what was great is because we had all these nurses to show up, it alleviated all that. And what was better, because the nurse practitioners were there, we would get Grandpa who hadn't taken his diabetes or high blood pressure medicine and would say, hey, I haven't taken this in a couple days. I don't have anything here. And the nurse practitioner would just go on his iPad and write a script real quick and then send him off to Walmart. And it was
they'd open up the Walmart and tap the pharmacy,
Yeah.
which eventually ended up empty 24 hours later.
But at some point, the National Guard had come in and had set up a more permanent, triage location across from us. And you can take it from here. With
Yeah, it was.
how
But
that process
we knew that
was.
they were there, and we had seen them in the parking lot at the Walmart, and then they left. And so as sundown was starting to come close, we could see a couple helicopters that were landing about a mile from us over the expressway, and which was covered in water. And so the only way to get there was to hang a left, hang a right, hang a right. I mean, you had to kind of go all the way around because this was water where we were seeing, and over the water we could see these helicopters landing. And that was a mall over there. And so what we didn't realize, and still to this day, we don't understand how this all got orchestrated, but so the military was over there and they were setting up a base camp. And what they were doing was they were parking massive amount of vehicles, a massive amount of boats, and then some fuel tankers. And they were like building this camp, but they're kind of building it almost for it didn't have much of a purpose. It was just strange. But that's what they were doing over there. They were setting up over there. And I think a lot of it was because they're getting ready to, where are we going to sleep tonight? So I think what they were doing was trying to cordon off a parking lot to sleep in. And so these helicopters were bringing in supplies over there. And we're taking the patients over here. And then all of a sudden, we were approached by one of the guys from the National Guard who had come over. He was looking for who was in charge. And the law enforcement officer brought him to me. And he said, I need you guys to move, which Robin wasn't in the mood to do at this point. No. And the tent is packed full of people.
And stuff.
And stuff now, and it's surrounded by stuff, and there's piles of clothes that are now sorted, by children's and adults, and so it's just a mess. And so he goes, we really need you to move over to the mall, and I was like, why? And he said, well, we're going to set up an LZ over there because now all of the regional hospitals have closed, and we are going to start seeing helicopters on a more regular flight pattern. And we were like, so what have we been doing? Because they were coming in every 20 minutes. And so all of a sudden it was like, we're gonna start to see a lot more patients throughout the night. We need you to move so that we can all work together because we actually need somebody to kind of head this up and organize this, and you guys seem to be doing it. So what's really funny is at this point, and at no point in the story, there was never any intervention by the government. Nobody ever showed up and flashed a badge and said, okay, you guys are going to do this and you guys are going to do this and we're commandeering your truck and we're doing it. Nobody ever did that. So I said, well, we're full of patients now. I said, so if you want to move us, I said, your troops are going to have to do that. And he goes, well, my troops are your troops, so just tell them what to do. And so I did. I said, move this. We had Alan with us, and Alan was like, you guys move this. And we just started barking orders, and these guys did it. And they literally loaded us up, and within 20 minutes, we were back over by the mall. And when we came up on the backside of the mall, the sergeant came out and said, "So what do you want us to do?" And they had popped the door on the loading dock of the Sears, and were trying to clear out it was full just of old displays. They were trying to clear that out so that they could have like a base office, like a place for a command staff. And so I said, well, I want the truck here, and I want the tents put up here, and what are we using that for? And they said, well, we're going to use that for our base of operations and our radio guys and all that. And I was like, okay, fine. Then here's this sea of military vehicles this way. And then the choppers really started coming. They established an LZ there, and which was about 100 feet off the front of our tent. And it was tight quarters. We didn't really have much of a choice because 100 feet the other way, you hit the water because the airboats would come right up into the parking lot and out of the neighborhoods. And so there we were with this LZ. Well, the helicopters, now these helicopters start coming in about every 10 to 15 minutes. And then it didn't stop. But we quickly ran out of room. As people were rescued, if they had medical training, we kept them. So we snagged those people pretty fast. Every once in a while, somebody would drive up in a car and say, hey, I'm a nurse, or hey, I used to be an EMT, or I can do this, or I can do that. And so we were starting to amass a pretty good team, pretty good medical team. So this went on for days, but what ended up happening was we were sending Jason out on night rescues. I'll let him tell you about that, but we were sending Jason out on night rescues because we had teams going out at night. And we were getting a lot of calls. They were using the Zello app, Facebook, things like that. People were calling and saying, hey, I'm at this address. I'm at 123 Main Street, and I'm on my roof. I need help. Well, the water was continuing to go up. So we were getting, notifications, can't get back up to Beaumont, bridges are closing. So that levee thing was not good. And we're operating a MASH unit doing everything that you can imagine a local hospital does times 5, because we have 5 local hospitals that were it was all being fed to us. And so we were literally just out of room. And so we started to push more things back in that loading dock. And then it was like, okay, so we can treat some patients here. And then like 3 hours later, it was like, okay, push more displays out of the way. Okay, we can treat more patients. And then finally the decision was made, okay, take all the displays out, let's reorganize them, let's make walls out of them, and let's make operating rooms. And so now all the displays were used to make operating rooms. And so the whole thing was kind of gridded out, and part of it was made into a pharmacy, which worked really well until that night, the first night that Jason went out doing rescues. We actually, in the morning while I was waiting for Jason to get back, these people came up to me and said, we have a problem. And what had happened overnight was the local pharmacy, which had become our only source of any kind of drugs at all, had closed obviously overnight. And we were waiting for it to reopen in the morning, and it was broken into that night and completely emptied. Somebody had actually gone down underneath the building and popped up through the floor, cut a hole in the floor, and had robbed the entire pharmacy and emptied it. So now we were down to more patients than we had before, but we had absolutely no drugs. We had nothing. Just right even down to simple things, alcohol, things like that. But that first night, as the sun started to go down, we were getting notified of more and more rescues that had to happen. And so we had to send teams out. And there was, I don't want to use the word militias, patriotic organizations, right? Yeah. We'll go with that. Yeah, that were there. And so what was happening was we had former military that belonged to these patriotic organizations that they went out to go do rescues. And it was a good thing, because what was happening was the gunfire, you could hear the gunfire from where we were. So in between the helicopters, you could hear gunfire out in the neighborhoods. And so that's where we sent you.
Yeah.
Because we were busy.
Yeah, so essentially, while they were off manning, the SMASH unit, I spent my nights doing rescues, but mainly, doing security at a hotel. One of our first nights working at the MASH unit, we got a patient that had tried to kick a glass door in with flip-flops on, and had cut his foot open. So myself and the paramedic kind of treated this guy at like 2 o'clock in the morning, and was saying, hey, there's this hotel about 10 minutes from here. There's a family of about 20 people, kids and adults, old people. They haven't seen and gotten any help. They need you. And was just begging us to go with him to this place. And
Keep in mind, communication was so bad. These people hadn't been told to evacuate merely because there was no way to tell these people to evacuate.
No, it wasn't.
So all the hotels had people in them that most of them had just had to relocate to the second floor of their hotels.
Yeah.
This is why the hotels were full of trapped people.
Because when this guy had come in, the water level was still pretty high up, and we were full expecting to go in on a boat and to help these people. So that next morning, we get in a truck, myself, a paramedic, and this guy Mark, go out to this hotel, and luckily where this hotel is located, the water had receded, and we had our med bags, and we were going up, and we go up there, and I get up the second set of stairs, and I see like kids playing. I see people kind of just out and about, kind of just there. And of course, like the head of the family, he goes and sees Mark. He says, "Oh, hey, welcome back." And Mark goes, "Hey, I've got help here. I've got real people here who are here to help." Because at this point, anyone that's approached this hotel has been there to either get them out because they're in a safe place, they've got electricity, they've got supplies, and they've been trying to run it out. And there's so many people looting. Everyone's very hesitant to accept help from anybody. But as soon as the guy saw us, we've got our stethoscopes around our necks, we've got jump bags full of medicine, and really there to help. We looked as official as it could be. Were happy to see us. There were kids who have been breathing in black mold, just horrible things through this whole time, and they were wheezing. A lot of the elderly people haven't been taking their medication, low blood sugar, high blood pressure, things of that nature, and we were able to kind of set up our own room and one by one triage and help these people. But in turn, as we spent the day trying to help these people and getting them the medicine they needed, getting the breathing treatments out, and giving all the men antibiotic ointment because of all the cuts they've got from being in the water for so many days, it came out in conversation saying, we're really glad that you guys are here because we really needed this, and you're the first people we've met from anybody who's been willing to help, because everyone that we've seen had guns, bats, and had tried to get us off this location, and we appreciate what you're doing, but our biggest issue is at night. Looting and gunfire was such a big problem in Port Arthur that people were going into this hotel taking TVs, alcohol, cash registers out from the bottom floors, which is horrible because where this guy has his family set up, was in the second level where the main lobby is, which is connected to a restaurant. So anybody with a weapon, a bat, a crowbar can break in, but it's only one stairwell up and a glass door that's between them and where his family sleeps, or where these people are sleeping. So, you could walk through and you could see these doors are barricaded on both ends, but if someone's committed to getting in, they're going to get in. So security was the topic. We've got one guy, this guy Mark, who had come in from Florida with the expectation to meet up with some patriotic friends and had gotten his truck flooded on the way in. So because his truck flooded, he threw all his guns and body armor onto a boat and had found this hotel, and they took him in. So ever since they took him in, he's kind of been, their security guy. But because he had tried to kick in a glass door with flip-flops on, he was kind of out of commission, and he was the only guy. The other men were also helping out, but they had, baseball bats and knives and whatnot, but weren't trained in weapons. They had a little .22, but that was kind of it. Where this guy Mark had rifles, but no one he could trust that had training to kind of operate it and kind of be on that level. So, me and this other paramedic come into play. Myself was in the Marines, and the other paramedic I was with has had training on firearms. So it became really easy that when they asked us to stay for the night, hey, we'll give you a room, we'll give you food, we'll give you, whatever you need, and we'll make sure that you're taken care of, because Mark here will give you body armor and a weapon. Because like I said, I was on vacation. I was in, cargo shorts and a t-shirt the whole time, and I had gotten my supplies from people giving it to me as they were passing through. So, of course, it was a no-brainer. I would stay. And essentially that entire time in Port Arthur, I would spend my nights doing security and I would spend my days with these guys. And it was at this point, you know, it was just, you know, really intense situation. Your lights, you know, was a pretty big factor in one of our instances, where we had people going into this bar and looting, and it became like a scenario where, you know, I'm in Texas, I'm not in Afghanistan, and I've got a loaded firearm with body armor on, and this could go either two ways. You know, they can either shoot back or they're going to run away. And luckily, in this situation, approaching this bar with no lighting, because we walk through it during the day, and it's, you know, it's slippery inside. There's sharp objects everywhere. It's, you know, lots of hiding places. Like you don't want to be there at 2 o'clock in the morning trying to find someone. And the idea is not to go in because it's just a place where you can get ambushed very, very easily. But one of these nights, we had come up. We saw movement. Myself, Mark, another paramedic, kind of approached this building. And, you know, none of us, you know, had the intention to shoot first. You know, that wasn't the whole goal. If anything, the whole purpose of security was to kind of be out in the open, to show people who were kind of scouting locations, saying, hey, let's not go here because there's 3 guys with rifles outside with body armor. Let's avoid that because there's other places that we can go to. You know, it was in my head that, you know, I'd be putting my weapon up, you know, walking down this bar thinking there's people in there, they're going to kill me. But if the situation came up, then, you know, we'd have to get them out because right where this bar is, it's a staircase up to where these kids are staying. And that was like the defining reason. But, you know, luckily it turned out great because what had happened was we approached the building, you know, told them, you know, they were trespassing, or we shined our lights on, lights that they had gave me. I'd shined one of them through the windows, and I could see movement and people kind of ducking about and had kind of yelled, you know, you're trespassing, you know, we've got weapons, we don't want to shoot you, so just leave now before this gets worse. And luckily, you know, as soon as I finished talking and kind of shining those lights through the broken glass, you could just see, you know, 4 or 5 people kind of just scatter the opposite side of the building. And that, you know, and that was purely prevented. I think we got them by surprise. They weren't expecting for us to be there, and it was kind of like, you know, fight or flight, and they just ran. And that was, you know, one of the great things about it.
I think the BTs were
Big part.
the big part because
That was what they were shining in.
Yeah, and you were so, you know, like that situation, and you know, when you're on a boat, you know, it's not cumbersome, but you have that. I mean, you've got that power. You know, it had the power, and that was a big issue. It was with all that moisture, everything's foggy. And so it was like heavy fog all the time. And a lot of people that have like never been caught in an area where there's been like a huge disaster, you don't realize how much you rely on ambient light, you know, or even light pollution, because even like, you know, if your power's out and you're in a big city, you know, and your power's out for several blocks, you don't realize how much ambient light is still like bouncing off the mall that's a mile away, especially in the fog. But when you're out in, you know, Port Arthur, Texas, in the bayous, and the power's out, and the power is out across the whole state, there's no ambient light. You got nothing. And, you know, so you're talking pitch dark, and you know, you can imagine like when we would come up on some of these areas and out where he was, you know, these places have no power. So you're coming up on buildings where you can't even make out what it is. Is this a motel? Is this an apartment building? Is this a store?
Like even going into the hotel when we first got there, you know, it was said that, hey, you know, we're medical, we're here to help. And one of my first things was to go through each hallway, each corridor, and go room by room and make sure people were okay. Because, you know, the family, anyone who was outside that saw us, you know, knew what we were, but we weren't sure if there were people in their rooms or people that didn't get the word. So we're going door to door saying, hey, you know, medical, we're here to help. And you know, none of the hallway lights were on. The only electricity really running through through the hotel was in a certain part where they were able to get like AC, you know, refrigeration, and some lights. But about 95% of the hotel was still pitch black because the way they had routed their electricity was through like one generator. It was able to get it through maybe 3 or 4 rooms. So that was where the family was at, whereas the rest of the hotel was completely powerless. So there were sections where it was pitch black. You'd open a door, and you needed to have, you know, good lighting. And you know, because of that beam and how bright it was, I was able to cut through and see where I was going. Because if I didn't have light, I'd be in the dark completely.
I think that the headlamps played a role out in the search and rescues.
Oh, yeah.
We had them on our rescue helmets, the Command 20s. That being hands-free when the threat's like that. Whether you're armed or this was just such a weird situation, but whether it's your medical scissors or your handgun, it really didn't matter. Having your hands free was really important because everything was slippery. You're holding on to the side of a boat. So having your hands free was a big deal. So while the BTs were great, I think the headlamps became important at that point. The scouts became like a convenience thing. It was just from making coffee to figuring out a suture to, just the little things, like you're
Finding something in the
finding
cab.
something, in the trucks. because black again, and so the Scout just became this thing where it was just always, something that was easy to just sit down and, you could clip it back onto your vest. But that was kind of nice because it was almost like a nightlight. And so it was nice to have those. The big lights, on the other hand, that was different.
Did some pretty impressive things with the primes and the 360s. I'll take care of the outside if you want to take care of the inside.
Yeah.
All right. Rotor wash on the primes was about 180 mile an hour. And we had set the primes up as a perimeter and had caution tape to keep people out of certain areas to the hospital so we could control them coming in. We didn't want them just mobbing us. So the primes set up at about 6 feet. So we didn't fully raise them, we put them at 6 feet. Took the rotor wash very well, stood their ground, and I was extremely impressed with the amount of wind that those lights would take. Lighting the whole area. It was a security issue on the outside of the hospital. That's why we were trying to control how people were coming in. So being able to light the area outside of the hospital and let the helicopters that were coming in know that there is a certain way that they can come in and go out and keep the camp safe. Us being able to light that area was a big part
because originally because there wasn't a lot of direction to them either, and we had no air-to-ground, ground-to-air contact whatsoever. We didn't know when the helicopter was coming in. They had no way to tell us they were coming in hot. And so if they're coming in with a critical patient, they would come flying right over our tents. Just literally, dozen feet on top of us, and they'd come in, and we were able to use the lights for direction. Because these are pilots this wasn't like your local medevac, although they were a part of it too. But these are guys that they didn't know Port Arthur any better than we did. So they certainly, whoever was giving them directions, telling them to go fly to the Sears and drop off patients, really wasn't much for direction. And
we did have the blue cap though.
We did. We definitely
used the blue flashing cap.
We used the blue flashing cap. And so that no matter who came in, whether it was a fresh helicopter with a fresh pilot that didn't know, a PJ jumping off of a Black Hawk, whatever it was, everybody knew where to go because one of the really cool things was we were using that scene cap on that one light. So the hospital always flashed blue. So, because it was surreal when you came down out of the helicopter. I remember the first time that I stepped off the chopper and looked at what we had created, what we were doing. It was surreal. It was like another world, and so, but that was something that was actually really effective, was having that scene cap. We didn't use any of the other ones, just the blue one. But what was cool was, you had all these lights because we had set up that perimeter, and then there was the one blue light, and that blue light was it was constantly pulsing, and we had it right at the entrance of the medical unit, and so that was really effective because even people coming up in trucks. Volunteers that were bringing patients, this is my grandma, and here's my baby not breathing, and I'm like that kind of stuff. There's people driving up. Well, they'd hit that perimeter, but it was funny because we never had a traffic issue because they aimed for the blue light. They knew that flashing blue light. They knew, and so what we ended up doing was we rotated that one light out, so that blue light flashed during the day too. We kept that scene cap going daytime and nighttime, so that became really important. And that perimeter of light that she's talking about. Light is safety. you know, on current deployments right now, we have issues with lighting and security. And you know this at your house, you know. I mean, if you turn your back porch light on, your house is safer than if your back porch light is off. And so, and we also know that the criminal element, likes to stay in the dark. And there's an interesting thing about the Foxfury lights that I noticed, never noticed it before, but there's no gradual dissipation of light with a Foxfury light. And I don't know why that is. I don't know if maybe it's every light and I just never noticed. But it just seems like you have this Foxfury light that shines halfway across this huge parking lot, but then it stops. Like, you know when you have walked outside of its zone, you know? I mean, it is, you are shining this light for 400 feet, but then it stops. When you walk outside of that circle of light, it stops. And what was so strange was, you know, here we had created, with not many lights, because we hadn't brought a lot of lights either. And I mean, there's less than a dozen that we were doing this with. And we're talking a mall parking lot here, that we are lighting an entire mall parking lot with. But what was so cool was, and dangerous at the same time, was that if you were inside of the Foxfury light circle, all was good. You know, there was no chance somebody was going to come at you, because you'd see them a mile away. But if you were outside of that Foxfury light circle, then you took your life in your own hands. And what was so weird was, right outside that Foxfury light circle, about halfway through that week, I think it was, I don't really remember, but we had a bunch of responders and some of these patriotic organizations that had their big old trucks and all their gear and all that stuff, and they were sleeping in their trucks, okay? So it wasn't like they just parked in the far end of the lot in the dark for kicks. They on purpose parked outside of the Foxfury light circle, and they lost everything they owned.
It was the search and rescue dogs.
And it was the canine search and rescue team, and they lost everything they owned. While they were sleeping in the trucks, their trucks were emptied, and all of their gear around their trucks, right down to like sleeping bags and their gas
cans
and everything was stolen because they're outside of that light. So that light created an incredible safety perimeter that was incredibly important. The military had brought no lighting at all. So, I mean, you know, we're like 12 lights outside, and we're talking 140 troops, you know, plus what we had amassed, which we were probably running about 60 staff, I guess, at our mass unit. Inside of the mass unit, a whole nother ball of wax, daytime and nighttime. And that was the use of the 360s inside. And that was just hands down. I mean, you know, to be truthful, you know, I mean, Foxfury's got competitors, and there's probably other lights that we could have set up all over a parking lot, but I don't know that there was a single light really on the market that we could have accomplished what we accomplished indoors, for sure. You know, I mean, you know, we had these 12 or so Foxfury lights outside. Maybe if we had 20 of the competitors' lights, we could have maybe maintained the same kind of thing, or 30 of the competitors' lights. But inside, it was very obvious this was the only solution. I mean, just knowing what the field is, you know, what the marketplace has for lights, there was nothing like that. And, you know, I mean, that's about as honest as I can be, you know, without this just sounding like, hey, I'm just endorsing Foxfury. I mean, I'm just being honest. We created an emergency room situation with ORs. I mean, this wasn't like, you know, hey, let me take your temperature and your blood pressure. You know, this was surgeries. This was, there's some serious procedures going on with no power, and here we had these cordless lights that ran all night, and it was cool because when we had a neurosurgeon at one time, and I still, God knows where he came from. I mean, he's from Port Arthur, but I don't know if did we rescue him or what? I don't know how we got him. But all of a sudden he appeared in our little camp, and he was like, you know, can I help? And we were like, well, are you medically trained? And he goes, well, I'm a neurosurgeon. So he had a pretty good sense of humor, and you know, because he was like just sort of trained. And it was great because I was going to have him work on me first, because by then I was going insane. And but when he went into the tent and he started treating patients, he was working on, and I remember he was working on this little girl. She was probably 10 years old, and I don't even remember what was wrong with her. It was like a laceration to the head or something. And I saw him working. Well, we had the 360 at the time in that corner. There wasn't a patient, so we would tip the lights up. So what would happen is we tip the 360 up, and that way it would just bounce over the ceiling. It would create lighting in the entire room. And then when a patient would come in, just like at the doctor's office, you know, they reach up and they grab the handle on the light and they pull it down, you know, and like the dentist does, pulls the light, you know, right up to your teeth. And so that's what we would do at the 360. When we'd lay a patient down, we'd just immediately just flip the 360 down, so it was like aimed right down at the patient. And and if we did that on spot and not on area, if we used that diffuser and we put it on spot and we tipped that thing down, it was crazy. I mean, you'd think you were in an emergency room. And I remember the neurosurgeon, his first patient was that girl. And he was looking at her head and he was trying to part her hair, and there's blood on it and stuff. And he was like trying to see, and the lighting was really good. It was kind of like this in the room because the 360 was bouncing off the ceiling and lighting the hole back into that tent. And I walked up behind him, I put my hand on his shoulder to make sure I didn't knock him over, and he knew I was behind him. And I just reached up and I grabbed that 360. Well, this is the first time he had been in the tent. And I grabbed that 360 and I tipped that thing down. And I mean, like, he literally like physically jerked back. And he made some comment, like, I mean, he was like, you know, like, holy cow, or oh my gosh, or something like that. But he was like, okay, this is a neurosurgeon, and what we just did in the field, in a town that's filling up full of water, with all hell breaking loose, was we just created the same environment that this guy is used to at a hospital in a controlled environment as a neurosurgeon, because he told us that afterwards. That we had literally, with that one light, had created the exact same environment that he was used to in a hospital. And it was, you know, so it was cool because we got to explain to him that, you know, this is cordless and this is, you know, I mean, we knew that it could do this. We knew that it could, you know, handle the load, or, you know, was up to the task. We knew that. But there was a lot of skepticism, man, when that first night started. But after that first night, I mean, it was funny because then the military started to get it. And they had never seen him before either. So then they'd come up and they started to learn what the lights were called. So, you know, then we'd get some military dude that would walk up and he'd be like, hey, can I have a now? We're going to go check the boats. Or, you know, hey, can we borrow a 360 and move it over here? And it was funny because they were like getting the, you know, they were getting the lingo. They were like starting to speak Foxfury or something. It was funny. So, but that's kind of how that whole thing morphed out. Was, you know, we were a part of something that, you know, and this isn't the first time we've shared this story. It's not going to be the last time. And a lot of why we want to share the story, you know, obviously to you, it's because, you know, your lights. I couldn't even tell you. There's no way.
Yeah. I mean, if it wasn't for your lights, it would have been surefire flashlights and headlamps that the military would have been using. I mean, if they
which they never pulled out once we rolled up,
yeah.
You know.
It just wasn't like you know, we had lights set up and it was just never an issue. I mean, I knew that if I hit on my little flashlight, it was gonna shine really bright. Or if I turned the headlamp on, then I wouldn't have to worry about it getting dark around me.
And we're talking tens of thousands of rescues, you know. So we have no idea how many patients we took.
You know, how many patients do you think you guys averaged a day, or at your busiest?
At our busiest, I thought we estimated over 500 on our busiest day.
Yeah, that's pretty. Because I mean, all the hospitals were closing around us. In fact, it got to the point where they were sending us, you know, people who were on 5150 holds, you know, mental health people. Like, we had no psychiatrist, no one, but the sheriff deputy was about to drop someone off.
We came up with a pretty nifty counseling office, though.
Yeah.
We built a little office out of cardboard boxes, and we had a couple mental health counselors. Right. They were at least nice enough to send us those people.
But I mean, that's how crazy.
Well, they sent us prisoners. At one point, we got prisoners. Yeah, from the jail, we had prisoners. They brought them over, but there wasn't enough law enforcement, so they dropped them off, and they just said, "Hey, by the way, these guys are prisoners." And we were like, "No, seriously." They usually come with, like, you know, handcuffs and a cop. It's like a kit, and they just kind of dropped them off, and they were like, "Yeah, you're gonna have to watch them." But you know, I mean, we're gonna keep telling the story, and the various portions of the story to different groups. And the reason why is because, I mean, here's the bottom line. The bottom line is you didn't see it in the news. And it sounds like, I mean, this is a story we could totally have made up, except for the part where we have it all on video and we have all the pictures.
I've got a flag in my backpack. All the people I've had sign it.
Of all the people that worked at the hospital.
I got a flag. I bought a flag from this guy. And everyone that I worked with at the hospital, on the boats, at the hotel, had personally signed from EMTs to nurses to doctors, nurse practitioners.
Everybody that had a part in
Officer
that.
Lem,
Yeah.
all the firefighters I worked with, volunteers from all hands. Every single part, every person I've had in contact with at sign, the whole flag is just filled out.
And people need to know about this because it didn't make it to the news, you know. I mean, Houston got a lot of attention, and then of course we had the disasters afterwards. But you know, people need to know about this story, and not because you know it's a Katrina story and it's the failure of the government, and you know FEMA wasn't there, or you know that's not the story, and that's not the story that we're telling. I mean, I'm not bitter that FEMA never showed up. I'm not, you know, I don't care. I don't know what the government would have done any different than we did. The reason why the story really needs to be shared over and over and over is because our country is horribly divided and torn apart right now. It's very difficult. There's 3 of us sitting here. The chances of us all 3 getting along for the rest of this day, based on the way that this country has run for the last couple of years, is pretty slim. And you know, to get 3 people together and having them get along. And so at a time when the country is in that kind of a situation, it requires something significant to snap the country out of that. And I think that this story could be one of those things, because what really happened was not that we treated patients. What really happened was not that Foxfury lights worked great. What really happened was not that, you know, the military worked well with civilians. I mean, those are all just like little tiny parts. What really happened was there's like black people and white people, and there's Mexicans, and there's Texans, and there's Nebraskans, and there's Iowans, and there's a Californian, and there was, you know, there's people that, oh good Lord. I mean, there was people from so many walks of life that are not supposed to get along. I mean, not just by tradition, just by common sense, are not supposed to get along. And they did, you know, groups that saved our lives a couple of times, that have the reputation of maybe not being that way normally. And they were the ones that we could count on. And, you know, it's hard to describe, but I can tell you that what we saw there in the parking lot of that mall, on the loading dock of that Sears, in those military shelters, on the airboats, on the choppers, was we saw Americans that were helping other Americans, and Americans holding other Americans and hugging them and comforting them. And there was no sex, there was no color, there was no uniforms. I mean, that was the biggest thing. There really was no uniforms. Nobody knew who anybody was with, who they came with, how they got there, and it didn't matter. And you know, it's sad that that the communities down in the Bayou and the Golden Triangle in Southeast Texas had to suffer such a great loss, to have a piece of America experience that. But man, you know, if we can tell that story, then maybe the rest of the country will, you know, maybe figure that out too. Because for a brief week and a half, we figured it out. We figured out how to just get it done.
Put you on the spot and ask you guys a couple quick hitting questions. First question: what would have happened if you guys weren't there?
People would have died. The military had nothing. No SLAM. They were not sent there to do that. There was no medical equipment. Good Lord, they didn't have beds. It was 3 days. The Marines showed up with cots for them to sleep on. They didn't. I don't think that their instructions were very clear, so they didn't bring anything. You know, the first several really serious situations that we had once we got over to the Sears parking lot would never have occurred without, you know, 12 shopping carts full of stuff that we took out of the Walmart. And thank God drug over the interstate. People would have died. I think we were also the voice of reason.
Yeah, it was, the tent that they had set up, our triage point, because the way things were set up was that our tent was where we would first get patients. Anyone who would walk up or get dropped off would come to us first, myself and all the volunteer nurses, and then if it became serious, something very serious, they would take them back to the warehouse where they had, the military doctors, the medics, that they were all hanging out. There was kind of two levels of kind of care. People who kind of had, splinters, need tetanus shots. Anyone who wasn't really critical came to us and we dealt with them.
IVs.
But IVs. Anyone more serious that had to go to hospital to get airlifted was going to go towards the back. And what was a great part of what we did there is that we became a central hub for all these volunteers, because if it was just a military unit, I don't think anybody who was, hey, I'm a nurse from Dallas, let's go drive 6 of us down to Port Arthur and help out, it wouldn't be as approachable. But if you see this white tent with other people in normal scrubs volunteering, then that's more likely, let's go there, that's where they're going. I wouldn't want to approach someone in ACUs and say, hey, I'm here to help, because you feel like
It's not very approachable.
it's not approachable. You wouldn't want to, because there wouldn't be a place for you. Whereas for us, you had nurses sleeping on the sidewalks and people coming in and out. We had like a place where people could go to.
Yeah, nothing says come on in like, 14 nurses sleeping on the asphalt.
Yeah.
But, the other thing too was that the military, because they hadn't come, they had the medics, and I think technically they had one doctor, because they sent us more people. At the beginning, there was no doctor,
Yeah, they
but
had
they
a bunch
had,
of,
but they
you
had
know, the Army
medics. It was like
medics.
the second or third day.
And eventually they came out with some more nurse
Yeah,
practitioners.
they
and
brought some
physician
more of these
assistants.
military medical people out. So when they were so shorthanded at the very beginning, what was cool was, their status medically was really no different, than Jason's. So all of these procedures and stuff for like the first 2 days, that was something else that was like really cool too, because you'd have like an Army guy, and you'd have a civilian, and they'd have a patient together.
And they would work together. And also what was great is that the strike teams from AMR had come in and set up their ambulances.
Yeah, true that. Yeah,
And they
AMR.
became really great with helping us out, because at first these guys were only told to stay in their ambulances.
Right,
and
their
when-
job is transport, right? So
like,
they're just
like
sitting
from a military
parked.
point of view, when you're looking at what your resources are, you have your transport, right? And these guys' sole purpose is to take patients from point A to point B. Well, there became a point where we were losing our volunteers when people were coming and going, and again, the numbers of volunteers shrunk between me and 3 other people.
Right.
And it became a point where these paramedics and EMTs were up from California, from Kansas, were kind of sitting in their rigs, and I said, hey, like you can do what I can do. Why don't you just get off your rig and work with us? And they say, well, we're not supposed to because the Army said so.
Yeah, this isn't our job.
Well,
Or our job
eventually-
description
well,
was
eventually
the
that
original.
changed.
Yeah.
Eventually that changed, and we're able to get in. So not only did we have guys from AMR come out and help us out, the Army medics and nurses.
Right.
It was just a jumble of people in this tent, and everyone just worked together regardless of where they came from.
Well, I think that's part of it, too, though. There was no job descriptions. There was one.
Help.
The job description was help. That was it. It was that simple. And I think that's key, because like you said with those AMR guys, and I think that whatever you want to call it, a brotherhood or whatever you want, because then that's sexist. I don't even know what word to use. Family, familia. That's what it became out there.
Camaraderie.
And it was, what was really neat was, to sum this whole thing up as to what it was like, because you brought up AMR, we had a line of ambulances on the side, and that was funny because they kept sending us more and more. And we started off with 1, then there was 2, then there was 6. But there was this line of ambulances. Well, the heat could get unbearable. And it was just blistering freaking hot. And the humidity, especially when you're in floodwater, nothing says humidity like a flood. And then you're off the Gulf, and the other storms were actually starting to brew, which we didn't know at the time, and so we were catching a southerly wind. But all that to say, here's how I can sum up what everyone did. The ambulance guys had no place to stay, and according to their protocol, could not leave the ambulance. So they would stay by the ambulances, which they couldn't leave running because everybody's short fuel. So they would sit in these hot ambulances in the heat. And so they would sit on the back of their ambulances and just try to stay cool, fanning themselves and drinking water. And there was a guy who, I think he had relocated or something. He was from New York or New England, something like that. And he was sitting on the back, and I watched this happen because I was standing there, and so one of my guys walked by him and said, "How you doing?" And he said, "Oh, it's just a little hot for me, man. I'm not used to the Texas heat." And he said, "Oh, really? Where are you from?" And I think he said New York. And so I watched my guy walk away, and he went and got a fan that he had been using to keep himself cool. And he had plugged it into the generator on our truck. And what he did was he took the fan and a 100-foot extension cord, and he ran the 100-foot extension cord all the way around the compound to the back of this ambulance, and plugged his fan into that cord and aimed it at the guy from New York and said, "Here." And the guy goes, "Well, what are you going to use?" And he goes, "Well, I'm used to the heat." And it was like, that's kind of how it was. That's how the whole thing went. Because it went beyond just knowing how to work together. It went to the point of, I'm not just trying to get this job accomplished, but I actually, because we're working together, I've actually grown to the point where I care about you. We're going to do this together, and I'm going to make sure that you last at least as long as I do. And that was kind of a constant, I don't know, don't you think? I mean, I think it was like a constant feel all the time, you know. I don't think anybody really bossed anybody around, which was odd, because I usually do. But a little. But like, it didn't have to as much, right? I mean, you know, it was more like a dance. It was like everybody just kind of, you know, as we got to know each other, you know, it was like everybody just kind of moved in sync that whole time. It was actually really smooth for something that was like so absolutely chaotic and really truly never did have leadership. It was, I think it's a lost moment in American history is what it is.
Yeah.
How important was it the lights were cordless?
Extremely important.
Yeah, it was great.
Crucial.
No tripping hazards in the hospital.
Yeah, not at all. And when you have so many people moving left and right, yeah, cords was the last thing you wanted in that room.
We would have needed 4,000 feet of cord.
Mm-hmm.
We wouldn't have been able to have the light we did.
How often did you guys reposition the lights?
The ones that we set up to perimeter, not hardly at all.
Okay.
The other ones were constantly on the move. We never knew where they were. The MPs, you know, are the ones that stole them the most.
Did you guys have to decontaminate them while there?
Yes. We were unable to decontaminate them while we were there. We actually had to package them, we wrapped them, and had to bring them home that way and decontaminate them after we got back because there was no ability to do that. The situation was, just to give you an idea without getting gross and into detail, all of our cots were thrown away. We were unable to even bring those home. That's how bad they were.
How valuable or how often? The fact that the nomads are overhead lights and not, you know, that they're potentially 8 feet tall and not, say, 5 to 6. Was that important for you guys?
Yeah, the light has to be over your shoulder. Anybody that's done a medical procedure, and I don't know that even as an EMT, I don't think it's as important as it is for a doctor or a nurse, but the light has to be over your shoulder, and so it had to at least be at that height.
How valuable was it that went over your head, not just your shoulder?
Oh, huge. You're talking about a tent that's meant to hold 14 people, and there are 60 of them in there.
I mean, the adjustability on that.
That was the
Be
other
able
thing,
to take
being
it
able to lower
from,
it.
you know, you have it extended all the way up when you start, but if it's something that you need the light down, you just drop the light down. It wasn't so much of how tall it was the ability to be able to go tall, short.
Yeah, and
The versatility.
We never tightened any of the knurls. We left them all so that the physicians, the surgeons, the nurses could easily just pull them up and down. We just did it so there was just barely enough tension that it was just like they were like on rubber bands.
And did you guys use the nomads on the boats?
Yes.
Which one?
Prime.
The prime?
The prime. Well, the nows went out, but yeah, I mean, thinking as far as the tall lights, yeah, we used them as searchlights. Shoulder carry.
How hard was it to get generators there?
Impossible.
Couldn't find them.
It took me, how long did it take me? 4 days, 5 days?
4 days.
4 days before I was able to get a hold of the governor's office with the military. We received approval to expend a certain amount of cash. It took me another day and a half trying to find a couple of companies and to get a hold of some of my contacts. And we ended up having a 12-ton generator with an air conditioning unit delivered, so a total of 6 to 6.5 days. And at that point, by the way, that only ran the air conditioner. It still didn't, that generator was never used to charge lights. All of the lights were charged off of our vehicle, every one of them.
When and why did you use each of the Nomads? In other words, when was a Prime more valuable than a 360 and vice versa, or now?
360 was when there was when it was a medical procedure. We didn't use the 360s for area lights because they were too valuable in the hospital and we hadn't brought enough. The Prime also became incredibly important when distance was a factor, security issues, being able to pop the diffuser off and immediately go from 60 feet to a mile was a big deal. And there were several times where we had to do that. And using the now was simply when it was something fast. I mean, truthfully, it was, you know, hey, throw me a light. The now would be the correct response to that.
How many Nomads could you have used?
Where we were, or on the mission itself?
How about both?
Where we were, we probably could have used another 20. Combination of maybe 24, combination of 360s and primes. What I would have really liked to do for security purposes because of the amount of traffic that was going on the other side with all the food and the supplies, it would have been nice to have put another 12, so now I'm going to say 36 because there was a traffic issue on the other side and we actually did have a very serious car accident. A woman almost lost her life over there. But on the mission itself, I would have to say another 120. Simply because we were sending people out with nowhere near enough adequate light to experience gunfire and the threats that they were experiencing in the boats, and that includes the military. They did not have the capability on their boats to do what our lights did.
You mentioned inside the tent having a 360 go from unit up
Yes.
and then having the physician unit down.
Yes.
Were there any other tips or tricks that you learned about that you discovered while out in Harvey about how to use the Nomads?
Yeah, laying them on the floor.
Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, when you're starting to try to actually build ambient light in a room, but you can't have direct light. You know, where the doctor's like, can you please move that light? It's blinding me. The one that's over the shoulder is the one that he cares about. But if you've ever noticed in a hospital, if you go lay in an emergency room, which I try to do on a regular basis anyway, they always have a molding that sticks out around the ceiling. So it's something that a lot of people don't pay attention to because they don't go to the hospital as much as me. But they have a recessed molding in the top of an emergency room, and there's usually a light down in that channel. So you can't see, and what that light does is it just softly bounces over the room. Well, that has two effects. One, it's a calming effect for the patient. It's a nice atmosphere. But the other reason is because that light, the doctor does not want that light. All the doctor cares about is this thing right here. That's over his shoulder because this is what he cares about, wherever his hand is. But that other light can actually become distracting to him. He doesn't want anything glaring in his eyes. So what we found was sometimes bouncing off the ceiling of a white tent, we could actually create that glare that irritated you know, whoever it was, the medic or whoever it was that was working. And so what we found though was that if we laid a prime on its side in the corner of a tent and just aimed it directly into the wall, the light was actually so bright that it would actually just bounce up the wall and then onto and it actually created that same atmosphere that you'd have in an emergency room. The only complaint that we ever had about the lights was actually that they were too bright at certain times. And that was when we had patients that were suffering from a situation where they needed to actually calm down. Because I remember one night when they had me move lights out of the back end of the tent because we had some patients that were trying to rest back there, and we had actually created, you know, we had been set up for more surgical procedures, and then all of a sudden we had these patients that needed to calm down back there. You know, the pregnant lady and people like that.
two last questions. Sorry.
Oh, I thought of another one too. We did take a now at one point. We put it underneath a cot at night in the back, and because we had people sleeping, and so we took a now and we laid it on its side and aimed it down to the floor, and we laid it under a cot. So it was almost like you couldn't tell where the light was coming from at all. And all it did, because we turned all the lights off at that end of the tent, and what ended, because that was more longer term care, people that were going to be there 4 or 5 hours, people that were on IVs. And what it did was you couldn't even tell where the light was coming from, but the whole floor was lit, which was really cool. So that was kind of a cool trick. We've always hung the scouts and stuff, from strings, from the ceiling and stuff. And that totally worked. When we finally got outhouses, which, for the record, took 6 days. When my outhouses finally were delivered, we put scouts on red in the outhouses because you don't want it blinding bright, but it was nice to have a little light in that outhouse. It was pretty dark.
Okay, so 2 more questions. Question 1, what's one improvement or one wish list item that you wish that the lights could have done out in Harvey?
Let's see.
I wish you could use them without the legs out. In that kind of a scenario, it would be really nice if somehow that base didn't always need its legs. Like there was time, when we had some bad situations where there's 3, 4 of us working on a patient, but we needed the light over our shoulder, and those legs stick out. Which the only way around that is, this is what we did, is we folded up the legs, and then we had someone hold the light. So that it was fully extended. They didn't have to hold the weight. They just set it on the ground and held it, but we couldn't afford the 3.5 by 3.5 foot triangle of space. I mean, really, truthfully, that's the only thing I can really think of, which isn't really a complaint. It's just, I don't know when we'll ever do that again. But if you have four medics working on a patient, and blood's flying and they're screaming, every bit of foot space when you're trying to dance around a cot, that could have made a difference. Mm-hmm. The other thing would have been IV poles. Someday I'm going to invent an IV pole that goes on a Nomad 360. That would have been pretty slick. Some kind of like a plant hanger that comes off the top. That would have been pretty handy because we were hanging IVs off of them. It would have been nice to have a little hook right there.
Okay. Last question. It's not an easy one. I apologize, but I gotta ask it. And if I could get each of you to answer, that'd be sweet. You guys had opportunities to leave. Why didn't you?
Like to leave.
Like you didn't have to stay there. You weren't being paid, and you weren't. Like it wasn't your job to be there. It was 100% a choice.
I mean, it was more for me. I was on vacation. I was. I had my nice clothes. I had shoes, cargo shorts, and this whole thing had happened. And I had my 2 days doing boat rescues. It was cool. I was able to do a lot and see a lot of crazy things, and more importantly, help a lot of people. And after day 2, my friends said, "Hey, we have the rest of this trip. We've got, we got to be somewhere at certain times," and that could have been it for me. I could have been like, "All right, cool, I'm good. Let's go to Arkansas. Let's go to North Carolina. Let's go to DC." But I didn't feel like I had accomplished really anything. It was great. I was on boats. I was doing this, but I knew that the job wasn't kind of done yet. I didn't feel like, I had done what I needed to do, and I'm already here. And, I had some time to play. I had about 2 more weeks to kind of go out and about. And so I said, "Hey, let me unpack my bags, let me get my laptop, and you guys can be on your way. I'm going to stay here, and I'll figure this out. I'll find a way home. I'll hitchhike or something," jokingly. And I remember, after we separated, and a couple days after, I'm on my flight home, and I'm kind of talking to this lady next to me on the flight on Southwest, going back to California, and she's like, "Oh, what are you doing in Texas?" And spent the entire flight talking about it. And I remember deplaning in San Francisco airport, and getting my stuff and kind of walking and to meet my parents, and I'm thinking, you know, I did it. You know, I came back and I felt like I did a lot because so much has happened in Port Arthur, working with these guys, working at the hotel, working with all hands, that I really felt that I accomplished something, you know, for me. You know, I could have, you know, gone on Instagram and social media and said, hey, look what I did for 2 days in Houston, you know, but I didn't. And I felt like I left Texas, you know, helping people and accomplishing what I did. And at any point, I could have just said, you know, I'm just going to get my plane ticket. And I could have called home. My dad could have bought me a ticket out of Houston, and I could have just gone home. But, you know, there's this camaraderie that you build with the people you work with. And when the person next to you is sweating and, you know, just as much as you are, you know, you don't want to be the first guy to say, hey, I'm done, and to cash out. And, you know, it felt right because they were leaving to go to Florida, and the hospital had kind of been relocated, and everything was kind of getting in place where, okay, well, the job is kind of finished now. Things have localized. Things have stabilized to the point where, you know, the people that we were at the hotel with had been relocated to a shelter. You know, there wasn't like a cliffhanger. There wasn't like anything where I wonder what happened to these guys. You know, it was a good closure for me. And, you know, it just comes into question with the type of people that this country needs is people to kind of go out of their way to help out. I've been really lucky with how things kind of unfolded, you know, from planning this random road trip that wasn't supposed to last as long as it did, to meeting Eddie and, you know, his family and this group of people. A lot of my friends say, oh, dude, you're a hero, you're a rock star, you're this and that. And, you know, I just like to think that, you know, if you were in my shoes, if you were an EMT, if you had met the right people and everything had lined up, you would do exactly what anyone else did. You know, I don't have a doubt that every person has it in them to go out of their way to help someone in need because at its core, we're all the same. We all bleed the same blood. You know, doesn't matter who you voted for, you know, your views on things, where you're from, how much money you make a year, or this and that. Well, what matters at its core is that, you know, is that you care about the person in front of you, that you're human. And that was great to see, you know, to see people come together from all over the country on social media, helping with dispatching people to houses, to letting people know where to stage and, you know, even mapping you to one point to another via, you know, real-time maps. You know, they live in New York and they're telling me take this next left because it's a flooded road in front of you. And, you know, living in an area or a place where you don't really get a chance to really do that much good. To see it, you know, I wasn't there for Katrina, I wasn't there for Sandy. I've just seen it on TV, and to be in a place to really see it live and see people come together it's breathtaking, and it really humbles you to what people can accomplish because so many people, you know, say I can't do this, I can't do that. I'll just give money. I'll write on Facebook, you know, that I'm praying for this group of people, but to physically go out there and do something out of your way, it's as simple as putting your mind to it, you know. Honestly, if the hurricane had hit and I was in California, I probably wouldn't have bought a ticket and flown out just to help out. But because everything had lined up the way it did, it made it easy for me to do what I wanted to. And everything's kind of spiraled out, and, you know, here I am. So it is a rough question, you know, why didn't I leave? And it just comes down to because I want to help. You know, the sole purpose of why I feel like I'm in this earth is to help people. It's why I have a big emphasis in medicine and becoming a nurse and working as an EMT. You know, at 24, I'm lucky that, you know, I found my niche that I can do for 20 years and apply myself to because a lot of my friends are still trying to figure that out, and they probably won't for another 10, 15 years. And I'm blessed to have met, you know, good mentors and good people to kind of lead me in a way to apply these skills and these experiences.
As hard a trip as it was in, it was a harder trip out.
This was the first time that my son had been on an actual deployment with us, and it was funny because 2 years ago, and I mean this is comparable in only my head, A little over 2 years ago, I sat in a hospital room with a gentleman who I barely knew, and as he was told that he had stage 4 cancer, and he was alone at that time, and I told him that I would stick with him, and that was, we all make statements like that, but when you have children, they watch you, and you better watch what you say in front of your children, because that's what I promised that man. I promised him I would stay with him, and I didn't realize that it was going to take over a year, and that I would learn everything there is to know about cancer, and there was a lot of times I wanted to quit. Because I couldn't afford it. I couldn't afford the time. Stole from my family. It was hard on me. But I didn't. And every time somebody would ask me why, I was continuing to do this for a guy that pretty much had been a stranger at the time that the whole nightmare had started, was because my children knew that I told him I would stay with him. And so if I didn't, my children would know that. And that's not how I'm trying to raise my children. So, 2 things jumped into my mind when you asked that question, why didn't I leave? One was because I had my son with me, and there's work to be done. And if I'm going to leave a legacy, bailing before the work was done in front of my son would have kind of negated whatever legacy I'm trying to leave. The other thing is that I was motivated by my son when we left. It's pretty hard for his mom. She's been used to the thing where her husband leaves and may not come back. And that's almost happened a couple times. And she has learned to cope with that. But this time, her idiot husband was taking her son, who she does like. And we were standing on the front porch, and he had a jacket on, which oddly enough was this very same military jacket that was worn by one of the guys down in Texas that became one of his closest friends now. And his mom came to the door as we were leaving to go to Texas, and she gave him a big hug. And they're pretty tight, them two. And she said, you just make sure you come back. And she said, you know the rule, Mom. And he tapped the flag on the shoulder of his jacket, and he said, I'll either wear it or they'll cover me in it. Either way, I'm coming back. The fact that my kid said that to my wife means that I've started to leave a legacy. Then to have him serve next to a former Marine who couldn't leave because there was work yet to be done. I didn't really have a choice. I kind of had to stay. I was left with no choice.